Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
We absolutely support Israel's right to defend itself in line with international law.
We need to safeguard financial stability.
2024 is not going to be an easy year.
We used to call it the dream of home ownership, but look at Britain now.
We've got to hang on to optimism and hope because it is the biggest driver of change.
Let's stop thinking of life in terms of Brexit. Let's move on and look for the future.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm James Woolcock. Caroline, I was toying with saying the budget is like Christmas for financial journalists. But I think that's a bit lame, even by my standards. But did you have fun? Did you get the presents you wanted?
Look, it was a longer day than I was expecting because Hunt spoke for just over an hour yesterday. Not hugely long, though, when it comes to actual budget announcements. It did seem to take a while for us to actually get to the sort of heart of the matter. There was a tax cut, of course. There was a bit on tax reform. Quite a lot of measures to try to attract or boost investment in the UK, like the new British ISA. We did know quite a lot, though, already about what he was going to announce, even before he spoke.
I think a lot is an understatement. We knew everything that was going to be there. We talk about sort of rabbits and hats. I think it really should be hunting for Treasury sources. He's been talking to all the financial press. The one thing that I think often gets lost in all this theatre is that money takes time. The British ISA, big China ISA, is consultation.
Yes.
The non-dom abolishment starts in April 2025. All these tax cuts to NIC, national insurance contributions, are going to take a while for people, even though they might see them in your pay packet quite quickly, before people actually feel better off as a result of them, before they feed into the economy. George Osborne used to say you need at least a year before tax cuts start to sort of impact on people.
Yeah.
So I've seen a lot of Tory sources recently say, this sets up us for an autumn fiscal statement for the election. I think we can go back to last autumn and look at sort of how well polls improved on the back of those tax cuts to take a view that how far do the public read this stuff? How far does it filter through? And how far does the economic gears start to get going on it? Yeah,
look, I thought at the beginning, actually, of the budget statement when Hunt stood up that it was going to be a real kind of crowd pleaser, a bit of a tub thumper. There was a lot of excitement and shouting. There was lots of jeering and as well. And I thought it was going to perhaps be, or I was expecting it to be the big event pre the general election. By the end of it, though, I don't think I was quite convinced. Anyway, let's see if anyone else was convinced then. And bring in our UK economist Dan Hanson and our politics reporter Jo Mays. Welcome to both of you. The Chancellor was quick off the blocks then, setting the tone for his statement by emphasising his government's economic achievements. Should we have a little listen to a bit of what Hunt said yesterday? Here it is.
In recent times, the UK and the UK economy has dealt with a financial crisis, a pandemic, and an energy shock caused by war in Europe. Yet, despite the most challenging economic headwinds in modern history, under Conservative governments since 2010, growth has been higher than every large European economy. Unemployment has halved, absolute poverty has gone down, and there are 800 more people in jobs for every single day that we've been in office.
Jeremy Hunt speaking to Parliament there. I don't know if you could hear some of the hecklers when he was going through some of the catastrophes facing. What about Kwarteng in the background? But so, quite some bold claims there. Jo, is Jeremy Hunt succeeding in this bid to present himself as the restorer of the nation's finances post-Liz Truss?
I think to a certain extent, in that clearly financial markets have stabilised significantly since he became Chancellor. Inflation has come down. Those kind of broader economic priorities that the government sets out are kind of heading in the right direction. But the bigger picture is whether the country believes that the Conservative Party is doing a good job on the economy and deserves their vote at the next election. And that's why there are significant doubts. I think that so much of what the OBR analysis of the budget said yesterday pointed to problematic statistics such as GDP per capita kind of falling, the tax burden rising over this parliament, living standards, as Resolution Foundation points out today, declining for the first time over the course of a parliament. So many big picture metrics that nevertheless paint a very difficult picture for the Tories, and that's a worry for them ahead of the election.
Yeah, absolutely. The Chancellor having to cherry pick some of the data at least. Let's bring in Dan Hanson at this point for the economic perspective. Was it a lack of creativity, a lack of will on the part of Jeremy Hunt, or simply the realities of the state of Britain's finances right now?
I think it's the third of those, to be perfectly honest with you. And I would say that, being an economist. But it's if you look at the OBR document, he had essentially no room for manoeuvre. And we already know that he's penciled in these very difficult and probably undeliverable, or almost certainly undeliverable, spending cuts over the course of the coming Parliament. So really what you saw was something quite interesting where we knew, as James has said, we knew most of it, but the Nix cut was meant to be the big thing, but actually he had to raise some revenue towards the end of the forecast to ensure that he continued to sort of hit his fiscal rule. But as I say, the sort of backdrop to all of this is that there are some very, very difficult decisions that are going to have to be made by the next government, particularly around spending, and how they deal with that, because the pressures there are going to be significant.
Yeah, okay, so significant pressures. I mean, we did do our best, though, in reporting this week to try to think about actually whether the UK is in such a bad position or not, early in kind of advance of the budget. I did a big bit of work with Philip Aldrich about the bullish case for the UK economy, and we had a discussion around that, and actually a lot of CEOs and business leaders are a bit more optimistic this year than they were last year, and they do see kind of an improving economic outlook. So it's not that it's all bad, but I do wonder whether Hunt was listening, because he said something really quite similar yesterday. Have a listen to that.
Surveys by Lloyds and Deloitte show business confidence is returning. In other words, because we have turned the corner on inflation, we will soon turn the corner on growth. And today's OBR forecasts also show that we have made good progress on the Prime Minister's 3 economic priorities. Compared to when the 3 pledges were made, inflation has halved, debt is falling in line with our fiscal rules, and growth is fully 1.5 percentage points higher than predicted.
So I guess, Dan, that is obviously a very optimistic painting of the UK economy. I wanted to put it to you, our chief UK economist. Firstly, this sort of GDP versus GDP per capita debate that Labour and the Conservatives are now having. And kind of secondly, is there a light at the end of the tunnel? The OBR upgraded their growth forecast for next year. Are we all being a bit too gloomy?
Yeah, so there's a lot there. So it was quite cheeky, that last fact from Hunt, because my understanding of the government's target was that there would be growth in the fourth quarter of 2023. So quarter-on-quarter growth. And obviously output fell. We're in a technical recession, so a bit cheeky on that front. I mean, I think in terms of GDP and GDP per capita, a lot of the good news in the OBR forecast is to do with a bigger population. That saved Hunt. The news we got from the ONS earlier in the year, that might have got him in the region of about £20 billion. The sort of higher population numbers. Obviously, it was offset by other things, but that was sort of a good news bit of the forecast. But obviously, the flip side of that, which is what you've just mentioned, is that GDP per capita or the outlook for GDP per capita is not as healthy as we would like. Where I would draw, to answer your question about the outlook, where I draw a distinction is between, in the very near term, these boosts of lower inflation, lower interest rates, confidence returning. You can see that, and this is sort of what Caroline and I discussed with Phil, you can see that producing what I would call a cyclical boost to the economy, so a sort of a 2024 boost, if you like. And you're right, the OBR had a very big, a small upgrade, I should say, to their 2024 forecast, but it's quite a lot higher than most people's forecasts for 2024. One reason, just to say on that, is that they didn't put the recession into their forecast. The economic forecast was closed. Their economic forecast was closed before they put it, so they would have downgraded a bit. But nonetheless, they've got a pretty strong 2024 forecast if you look quarter on quarter across the year. And I see the case for that. Things like falling energy prices, hopefully lower interest rates at some point, falling inflation, and a shift in consumer sentiment, which is what Hunt was mentioning there with the surveys. The underlying picture, though, and this sort of long-term growth story, I definitely think the jury's still out, and I'm still sort of on the pessimistic side, particularly relative to the OBR. I mean, one thing the OBR people tell the OBR off for being too pessimistic. I think they're too optimistic about. Maybe that's just because I'm miserable. But
it's a common theme in the city, isn't it? That sometimes the OBR is seen as compared to City economists and others, they can be a bit
absolutely. Yeah,
bullish.
I mean, if you look at their trend growth forecast, they think the economy can grow by 1.75%-ish in the medium term. Most City economists think it's about one and a bit. That's similar to the Bank of England. That, over a 5-year period, is an enormous lift to the level of GDP, and so tax receipts, and so the fiscal position looks far, in many ways, far prettier. I know that seems weird, but it's prettier because of that judgment that they're making. So I would make that distinction between short term. Yes, I think there is this bull case. I think there is a bullish case for the economy, but medium term, I didn't see the budget changing that picture.
Joe, I want to bring you in on this point then. How do you think the budget was received then overall by the Conservatives and by MPs? Do you think they'll be satisfied? Because there was so much anticipation around and pressure from Tories, obviously staring into the headlights of a general election.
Just one final point to add to that previous discussion, which is that economists at Citi have today put out a note saying that if that trend growth rate was just kind of only a little bit less than what the OBR is predicting, then Hunt would be offside, so to speak, against his fiscal rule by 50-60 billion pounds. So it's really true that he's really playing it at the margin here, and he's benefited by that rosy outlook from the OBR that you just discussed. In terms of MPs, I think that I was outside the 1922 committee meeting last night in Parliament where Jeremy Hunt addressed his MPs. Noticeably, there was quite poor attendance. I'd say there were only 25, 30 Conservative MPs who came. Usually it's a lot higher than that. And that spoke to, I think, an underwhelming sense from those MPs at this budget. They didn't really feel like there was much to get excited about. One MP who spoke to me afterwards said, look, we thought there was going to be a real rabbit in this budget, and there wasn't, because obviously the national insurance contribution reduction had already been trailed. So that was one where they were left pretty disappointing. One MP in the meeting told Hunt that they should have been cutting income tax instead of national insurance, because income tax, in this person's view, is easier to sell on the doorstep to voters. It's easier to understand. It affects more people and would be more likely to give them that kind of pre-electoral boost. But then at the same time, there are those in the party who think that this was a pretty sensible budget in that by going for national insurance rather than income tax, you reduce the risk of potential inflationary pressure. And that means that it's more likely that interest rates might come down in the short term. And they see that as an important backdrop that they need if they want to win the next election.
I think, Joe, it's fair to say that reactions to the news have been sort of pretty mixed, not just Tory MPs, but sort of the broader public, in terms of you look at some of the polling that's coming out of it. But obviously, the one thing that many in the party were very happy with is that they shot Labour's fox in terms of taking on the non-doms tax and abolishing that. So here's what Rachel Reeves had to say.
Well, it is an utter humiliation for the government that in the final budget of this Parliament they've had to resort to taking Labour ideas because they've run out of ideas of their own. Now, we made pledges around reducing NHS waiting lists, breakfast clubs at primary schools to help ensure all children get a good start to the day and help parents, particularly mums, get back to work. And what I will be doing now after the publication of all the documents yesterday is to go through all of those and identify how we can make the savings to continue with the commitments that we have made. And we'll do that in an orderly way and also ensure that all of our policies remain fully costed and fully funded.
So I guess, Joe, how much of a damage has this done to Labour's plans to raise revenue, given they've tied their hands in so many other ways of raising tax?
Yes, it does create a tricky situation for them. But as Rachel Reeves was just saying, they don't really want to fall into that trap the Tories have laid yet. They're just saying, look, in our own time, we will look at our spending plans and we will come up with how we'd fund them. So they're kind of not engaging at this point in time, which probably seems the wisest thing to do. But I think also so interesting this morning that Rachel Reeves really went on the attack against Jeremy Hunt over that commitment that he had to eventually abolish national insurance. And Rachel Reeves was saying, if you do the sums, that would cost about £46 billion. And now Rachel Reeves is saying, now you're the party who has a big, effective, giveaway that you aren't saying how you'd fund that. And Labour tried to tie that back to the Liz Truss episode. So they've almost seen like an opportunity here to try and turn the tables on the Tories and say, no, now you're the party with big unfunded spending commitments in the future. So, yeah, real interesting moment for Labour, and they're kind of trying to hit that challenge head on.
Yeah, absolutely. The Shadow Chancellor was speaking to us on Bloomberg TV this morning. Yeah, I thought it was interesting. She was... it strikes me almost that there's just one centre ground in the UK, and that it's a game, between the two parties of which one manages to stand on that centre ground with the most sort of quote sensible policies in order to appeal to voters in Britain. And that's what we've seen. The big electoral changes of the 70s and 90s and perhaps now. Dan, do you think that Rachel Reeves is right when she was talking to Bloomberg this morning, saying that the Tories have run out of economic ideas? I mean, it just looks like they've also run out of room, and that will be handed over to the Labour Party if they are to win in the next election.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things there. I mean, this is just your characterisation of the election itself and what we'll be, as voters, be confronted with is just so different to, say, even the last two elections, the 2017 election and the 2019. The difference between what was on offer there was enormous. Now it's, we're arguing over non-doms, which is a tax policy that raises £2.6 billion. It's a tiny amount of money. The reality is that whoever's in power after the election, the big decision is, as I said at the start, is going to be around spending and how they find the money to finance public service spending, because that's the thing that at the moment is the big elephant in the fiscal forecast, if you like. That's the real challenge. I mean, in terms of imagination, have the Tories run out of imagination? I don't think that's probably fair. I think what would be fairer is to say that I was really surprised yesterday, having covered budgets since 2000 and before the financial crisis when I was in the Treasury. There was no rabbit, and I think that might be the first time there was no rabbit out the hat, that we knew everything that was coming, and that really, really surprised me. Now that might speak to a lack of imagination, but it also might speak to another channel that you guys have alluded to, and Joe alluded to as well, is that actually keeping markets calm, potentially getting interest rates down, getting some good news on inflation, hopefully in the middle of May, when that April CPI number drops, potentially some news on the economy coming out of recession, which will come at a similar point. That's what they're waiting for with it. And actually, if looking at it, it doesn't seem outrageous that they might go for another fiscal event before the election. Looking at that is just a lot more sort of barnstorming, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And perhaps it also goes to the longevity of Hunt as a politician and just the seriousness with which they take trying to recover from the Liz Truss mini budget, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah, you could take it the other way, though, briefly, which is to say that they're all planning for a November election and they want to have an autumn statement there, and this is keeping whatever spare powder they have dry for then.
Yeah, I mean, there's a legacy issue for Hunt, of course, that if nothing else, he can walk away saying, I steadied the ship and I didn't do anything that rocked the boat in the run-up to the election, and sort of don't blame me for whatever happens. But you're right. I think, James, you're right that if you look at what happened yesterday, there's you put some good money on them doing potentially something else and then sort of going for an election later in the year, because it just didn't feel eye-catching enough. Not that I'm sort of an expert in politics, but just having covered it for so long, there just wasn't that big thing at the end. As he built up to that national insurance announcement, I thought, oh, here we go. There's going to be he's going to say something about income tax or something like that, and it just didn't come.
Well,
so
to turn to our expert in Westminster, Joe, have you been hearing from any of your sources that an autumn statement is now more likely?
I think that it's just thinking about everything that's happened, you can just infer that it's now more likely. I think that the idea that they would now call a May election just seems really completely off the cards. This isn't a budget into which you'd want to go into an election. You don't have some kind of big significant giveaway that the papers are all cheering about and so on. So I think that the base case now has to be that there will be another fiscal statement, and it also, the base case has to be that the election would be in the autumn. Indeed, Jeremy Hunt was saying on the broadcast round this morning that's his working assumption. Maybe take them for their word and their actions, which just that's what's now going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I want to also insert one other thought, because it's quite unusual that there is a kind of big talking tax expert. And the UK, I think, now has one in the sense of Dan Neidle, right, who is quite well known now, of Tax Policy Associates, the founder of that business. He was also formerly at a big, tax consultancy, and his tweets have done more to bring attention to tax issues than I think, frankly, anybody else. And you might say that the Chancellor's response and the changes to the childcare tax regime in the UK are perhaps quite a consequence of what Neidle's been saying. So he was somebody else that we spoke to in reaction to the budget. Have a listen to what he said.
National insurance is a bad tax. You pay it if you are employed. You don't pay it if you're an investor receiving dividends, a landlord receiving rent. And that creates a very damaging incentive for people to adjust their status from employed to self-employed just to save tax. We're punishing work. We're rewarding tax avoidance in many cases. It's not a rational way for a system to work. So over the long term, if we could cut national insurance and move it into income tax, most people would get a tax cut, and it would be a good thing for the tax system.
The non-dom status, is that a practical move for the UK to modernise its tax system? Is it going to take in as much revenue as the Chancellor hopes?
Yes. The non-dom system is eccentric, bordering on crazy. It relies on this concept of domicile, which can't really be defined, which is hundreds of years old. So replacing it with a simple count of the years you're resident here makes a pile of sense. Your reward for being a non-dom is that you are exempt from tax on money you keep outside the UK, but then you're taxed if it comes into the UK. So you're rewarding people for not bringing their money into the UK. Why on earth would a rational tax system do that? So reversing both of those features, having a simple test of residence years and having a simple exemption for, they suggest, the first 4 years is a rational way forward.
OK, so we found two measures that you liked in this budget. Let's turn to one that you didn't like. The British ISA. You've been very critical of this idea before. What's the problem?
The big picture problem is, hang on, everything that we know about economics and investment theory tells us we should be encouraging people to diversify. A rational investor should hold UK equities as a proportion of the UK markets to the global equity market. So about 4%, something like that. So why do we want to encourage people to overinvest in UK equities, particularly when UK equities, at least the FTSE, has underperformed so badly over the last 20 years? It seems very curious for the government to push people into making bad investment decisions.
That was the founder of Tax Policy Associates, Dan Neidle, talking to Stephen Carroll earlier. I mean, Carroll, it wouldn't be the UK if most of our policy weren't set by people on Twitter, X. We do have a bit of a weird obsession, especially ministers, with sort of following on what is the social media debate. But Joe, just to bring this to you, I mean, YouGov polling from February shows that much of the public would prefer increased public spending over tax cuts. So trying to get away from very smart wonks on Twitter, is this muted budget by historic standards, to take from Dan's sort of comments earlier, actually going to cut through with the public?
I mean, all the early evidence suggests that it has had and will have a pretty limited effect. I mean, we've seen kind of focus group responses overnight with many, 2019 Tory voters, that key group that the Conservative Party is trying to hold on to, being basically pretty unimpressed with this budget. If you're a pensioner, there's basically nothing for you, and that's a pretty important kind of core part of their vote. I think that just without having that kind of real headline-grabbing, income tax measure or something like that, then they're really struggling. And to your point about public services, I think that the Conservative Party is probably aware of that polling, but they think, what do we want to go into the election having the dividing line being? And I think that's why they're focusing on tax, because they want to go into an election being the kind of low tax party versus, and try to lay the gauntlet for the Labour Party and say, look, we want you to be the high tax party. So that's why they're probably not wanting to prioritise spending on public services at this point, because they've got that election framing in mind.
What about the issue then, not of taxes or of spending, but of inflation, which has been the big issue in the last few months, year? Are we getting over that inflation hump? Is that going to get better before perhaps an autumn statement or an election?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that as Joe answered the question, that the inflation picture will, fingers crossed, look significantly better come the autumn. I mean, it's now sort of baked into the, or it seems baked into the system, or baked into nearly everyone's forecast, that we'll get a fall below 2% in the second quarter. There's a bit of a debate about how much of a rebound you then get in the second half of the year. but we're at 4 now. We'll be somewhere around 2 plus or minus a bit in the autumn. That's a much easier backdrop if you do think income tax is inflationary, which it probably is a little bit relative to Nick's at least. That's a much easier backdrop to go ahead and do something like that. So I think all of this, if you think of the sort of strategy and what the government at the moment is thinking in terms of the economy, you've got, as I say, these 2 very big data points coming in May. One is on GDP, and that will potentially say that we're out of recession, and the other one is a fall below 2% on inflation. And those, you can see those 2 things being a big part of how they take things forward into the second half of the year.
Our chief UK economist Dan Hanson and politics reporter Joe Mays there, helping us make sense of what seems to be a budget historic, not by its size, but by its frugality, Caroline.
Yep. So that is then the day after the budget here in the UK. That's it from us for now. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineers were Marufal Hussain and Sean Guastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.